Hello, it's the Coaster Craze, and in my latest coaster review, my first video of 2021, I'm talking about Vekoma SLCs, specifically Mind Eraser at Six Flags America and Riddler Revenge at Six Flags New England. So these are the two SLCs I have ridden, and it's mostly going to be geared towards Mind Eraser, since this is the more typical SLC. They both have the same layout, of course, but Riddler Revenge did receive a couple years back during the off season new trains which have much better restraints, and I'll talk about that later towards the end, just about how that's improved the ride experience. But for the most part, their ride experiences do not differ much. So this review goes for pretty much all SLCs, and then I'll talk about the distinction in trains slash restraints towards the end. So to get started, the stats are pretty average, which is not bad at all. The most impressive one I'll say is 5 inversions, where it only has about 2,200 feet of track. That's a lot of inversions in a short span of time, so I think that's pretty cool and definitely can give some intensity. The ride isn't super long, but again, we'll talk about later, that's not a bad thing at all with an SLC. But overall, they're okay, and for a clone, it's pretty large and pretty impressive, I would say. And can go to a lot of smaller parks as well as fit in with bigger parks. I should also mention the theming and scenery here. And this is, of course, not going to apply to every SLC, but in general, they're pretty lowly themed. And of course, the scenery can depend on the ride, but since it is, like I mentioned, a cookie cutter clone, it's going to be placed on a flat plot of rectangular land, and so usually won't have much interactions with the terrain or cool scenery. Of the ones I've been on, Mind Eraser probably is a slightly cooler placement, and that's kind of in this wooded section of the park, so you feel pretty secluded, while Riddler Revenge is kind of up against a hill, so it could give a good view of the back half of Six Flags New England. And in terms of theming, both of them are very minimal. I really do like the entrance sign and station of Riddler Revenge, though, and Mind Eraser has like pretty much no theming except that it is kind of themed to the ride itself. It does erase your mind a bit, which I don't think is what the park intended on. And of course, there are going to be some very well themed SLCs out there, often like in countries like in Europe. But this is usually not a very well themed or scenic coaster, unfortunately. So then a lot of it rests on the layout and the intensity and the ride experience to deliver. And as I've kind of alluded to very clearly throughout this video, it doesn't really deliver. So in terms of the layout, basically it starts with a bank drop that's about 100 feet and it gets you to a speed of about 50 miles per hour. And then it goes into the first two inversions, which are a rollover, and following that into like a bank turn that then goes into the third inversion, a Sidewinder, turns around again for the final two inversions, back to back inline twists, and then a couple more turns into the brake run. It's a pretty simple ride. They're just kind of going back and forth in this very tight, compact, rectangular plot of land, and packs in 5 different inversions of decent variety. So how did these stack up in terms of intensity? I think that this ride delivers some pretty good G's, especially the first half. The second half definitely feels like it wanders around a bit, but again, intensity I feel like is always really hard to tell when it's a rough, uncomfortable ride, and that is definitely the case with these Vekoma SLCs, because there is definitely a lot of positive G-force, but in those moments you're not like enjoying the intensity of the G's, but instead just bracing for all of that like head banging and just roughness and jerkiness. I think a big part of why these coasters are so rough and so uncomfortable is the restraints, but another part is the transitions, because the restraints you can look at Mind Eraser and be like, oh yeah, they're god awful. Your head is just gonna go back and forth constantly during the ride. And yes, that can happen a bit, but on my most recent ride, I leaned my head forward during most of it, and I only got banged around maybe a couple times. Yet, I still came off pretty much hating the ride and with a bit of a headache. And then you look at Riddler Revenge, which I went on. This has very good restraints. You are not going to get any headbang on them. They're the vest restraints. But I still came off with a bit of a headache. Not as much as Six Flags America's, because they did do some good work on it, but I think it really does come down to the transitions. They are so jerky from one element to the next. And the interesting thing is, it starts off pretty good, which like you'd think, oh, maybe the ride will keep up, but no. So the drop, the first two inversions, that rollover, and then that first bank turn, I actually really enjoy. On my last ride on Mind Eraser, it was at night in the front row. It was a Zen ride. It was kind of cool. And I was like, wow, this is a good start to the ride. Maybe it's actually going to be pretty good, and I'm just remembering it wrong. And then the second half kicked in, and starting with the Sidewinder, things just got so rough and uncomfortable. It's again a little hard to tell how rough the track is, but I think a lot of it does come down to the transitions. Of course, the rough old style Vekoma track does not help, and then with Mind Eraser especially, those restraints just exacerbate all of those issues. So it gets into some really tough territory when you combine the three worst things that can contribute to a rough and uncomfortable ride. Six Flags New England mostly remedied the rough track, and they completely remedied the poor restraints, but there still was the jerky transitions that hold it off. So any Vekoma SLC is not going to do too well in my books. So before I get to my final score, I just wanted to quickly mention the reliability and capacity of these rides. And luckily, these are pretty reliable, I would say. I have seen Mind Racer down sometimes at Six Flags America. It's my home park, so you're going to see all the coasters down. But this is definitely one that maybe you want to get to earlier in the day because the capacity is pretty poor. Often I see these running with only one train and only sits two across, not like the B&M inverts. So it can get a long line, strangely enough, even though, of course, coaster enthusiasts hate these coasters for the most part. So this is definitely a coaster that, I would suggest only riding for the credit and then moving on. If it's at your home park, maybe you want to go back to it in a couple years just to see how it's running. But if you're at a new park, this is something to do right when you get to the park, maybe, or pretty early in your day, so you don't have to wait in a long line for such a terrible experience, and then move on to much better coasters. So for their final score, I'm going to be giving Mind Eraser and the regular old school style Vekoma SLCs with the poor restraints a 3.5 out of 10. This is a very below average ride going into very bad territory, and I would really only say is for the credit. Now, Riddler Revenge and the other Vekoma SLCs that have gotten the newer updated vest restraints, I'll be giving a 5 out of 10. So very average because, again, I don't think the layout's very bad at all. I like how it packs in these 5 different inversions and some fun turns into a pretty short and compact ride experience that can relay some good intensity, but it's still dampened by some really uncomfortable transitions that just make it not a fun ride and not something that I can re-ride. For a ride like Riddler Revenge, I would say it's something you maybe do once every few visits to the park. It's an okay experience. You're going to get some fun out of it. You maybe get some discomfort out of it. I know some people that like it a lot, but personally, it isn't something I would ever seek out. So unfortunately, I think that's the best a Vekoma SLC can get, a 5 out of 10. And the worst is probably around a 3.5. Maybe there's some worse ones out there, like a 3. Definitely comment down below your experiences with different Vekoma SLCs if you found some are worse than others, because like I said before, I've only been on 2. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching this coaster review. This is the Coaster Craze signing out. Make sure to like and subscribe and comment for much more coaster content coming soon to the channel, especially as I near that 500 subscriber mark. There's going to be some very fun videos coming out. I'll see you guys later. This is the Coaster Craze signing off. Goodbye.